such strange emotions for him. Their relationship sometimes felt ridiculously complicated. Natalie called out, Bryce, you haven't told me why you came back so early from your trip. He paused. I felt like coming back, so I came back. Natalie was exasperated by this answer, but let it go. Bryce could be so opaque sometimes. Bryce went upstairs to his study to take care of some business matters. The truth of why he'd come back was that he was concerned about Natalie. He'd hired a private plane to bring him back in a hurry as soon as he heard about what was happening to her. He told himself that he didn't really know what he'd been thinking when he decided to come home. It was just an impulse he couldn't ignore. Bryce, in his study, slowly turned over the words Davidson family in his mind. It seemed as if Natalie had let the Davidsons play upon her vulnerabilities again. She was an enigma, that was for sure. So bold and yet so easily embarrassed. Thinking about this, Bryce smiled in puzzlement. A gentle look appeared in his eyes. He had never felt this way about a woman before. Office, she looked at social media of the sequel to The Crossing 2. When this news came out, quite a few people to check Tony Bavil's social media account, linking to the post that Natalie had put up previously. Tony's page was quickly bombarded with comments from many fans, as was Natalie's social media. People began to leave messages praising Tony and reminiscing about his past glories playing the character Crossing movie. Tony B is as handsome and he's Zeb. Only Tony Bavil can play Zeb Ballard. There'll never be another Zeb. The Zeb Ballard character had generated some fans and fame for Tony back in the day. But after Mark Ellington deliberately buried Tony's career, Zeb Ballard's profile had also. Now, due to the news about The Crossing 2, Tony Bavil's potential performance, Tony's social media following increased by tens of thousands in a single morning. Natalie browsed through social media on her phone and smiled happily. She called Tony, but it took a long time for him to pick up, as he was training. Hey, Natalie. Tony was still slightly out of breath from his extensive exercises. Natalie asked, Have you seen the news? No. What happened? Go and take a look at the entertainment pages on the internet. There's a surprise for you. Natalie couldn't hide the happiness in her tone. Tony picked up on Natalie's happiness and it lifted his mood. Okay, sure, he said. When he opened up his browser, he saw that he had hit the search charts. He hadn't been in the news for amazed. Only after looking carefully did he that this was all because of the video Natalie had shot and posted the other day. The Tony in the video was full of resentment, anger, despair, and foolishness, clearly showing all his emotions. The day it was shot. When he saw it today, he was shocked by his own performance. Tony wondered, was this really him? He thought that he would never have a moment of fame again. Mark Ellington's oppressive bullying had made Tony give up on himself. Recalling all those years of insults, his eyes became moist. As he read more about himself online, he realized that a lot of his old fans had left messages for him because The Crossing 2 was going to be filmed. Tony Bavil, the best in the world. We've been waiting for you for many years. Tony, no matter what you're going through right now, I will always support you. Tony B, never give up. We love you. The number of hits and comments had increased by tens of thousands. Tony was getting even more emotional. After so many years of silence, it was moving that there were still so many fans who supported him. His hopes, which he thought had withered away long ago, came back to life in these moments. Episode 64, Rival Stars. Looking at the appreciative comments on social media, Tony Bavil's heart was filled with warmth. That growing warmth took root in his heart, and he began to feel more and more determined. He decided to give Natalie a call. Natalie picked up the phone, surprised to hear from him so soon. She said, "What's up, Tony?" He said, "Natalie, I've seen all the love for me on social media. Thank you so much. It means so much to me. It's like I'm starting to see the value of my existence again." He was choked with emotion. Natalie, although touched, said briskly, "There's no need to thank me. It means so much to me. It's like I'm starting to see the value of my existence again." He was choked with emotion. Natalie, although touched, said briskly, "There's something else I wanted to ask you. I was really touched when I saw the messages on social media, all those people reaching out to me. And I want to ask you whether I can reply to those people's messages." Tony's cautiousness irritated Natalie a little. She said earnestly, "Replying to messages is fine. You're an independent individual and you have your freedom. You really don't have to ask my permission for everything you do." Tony said, "Okay," but felt a little like a kid who had been scolded. Natalie continued, "But remember that you will be a big star in the future. So from now on, you have to think about everything you say and do. You have to make sure that there's nothing that can come back to bite you on your back and spoil your success." Tony agreed, feeling even more grateful towards Natalie. He knew for sure that he hadn't joined forces with the wrong agent. Natalie had taught him a lot, and the most important thing of all was that he had gradually regained his confidence. Elsewhere in town, Mark Ellington woke up early that day. Almost the first thing he saw when he picked up his phone was Tony Bavil's hot internet presence. The content related to Tony was going viral, spreading and bubbling. Ellington's face twisted with fury. He threw his phone on the bed angrily. "Ridiculous! What did that dumb woman do? How did things turn out like this?" Hearing Ellington's raised voice, Curtis Westing emerged from the bathroom, smiling faintly. Curtis said, "Mark, what's wrong? Why are you getting so angry so early in the morning?" He came and sat on Ellington with friendly concern. Seeing Curtis trying to cheer him up, Ellington's mood improved a little, but his face was still gloomy. He threw his phone. Curtis picked up the phone warily. Tony, he was shocked. He said, "How could that happen? Could it be that Natalie knew that there was going to be an announcement about The Crossing 2 and posted that social media post in advance?" There was jealousy and annoyance in Curtis's eyes. The Crossing 2 had always been something that he had wanted to be involved with. Was he going to let that brat Tony steal his chance to star in it from him now? In fact, if Curtis hadn't wanted a role in that movie, relationship with Ellington develop as it had, he had to further his career. Curtis tried to hide his anger and said, "And anyway, who is this Natalie really? She's pretty amazing, I've got to admit." Ellington shook his head and said, "She's just struck lucky, that's all. All this social Bavil means nothing. That movie role definitely belongs to you." But Ellington was more troubled than he was revealing. He'd already checked out Natalie's career history. She'd worked with a lot of artists overseas, and she'd clearly shown that she was a very capable professional. That made her a real competitor to him. But Ellington would rather believe that Natalie was just lucky, and her luck wouldn't last. It wasn't certain yet who would get the part in The Crossing 2. Curtis was staring thoughtfully into the distance. After a while, he said, "Well, Mark, you promised me that role, remember?" Ellington chuckled. He smiled at Curtis and said lightly, "Don't worry. If you do as I say, everything will be yours for the taking." Curtis laughed, feeling reassured. He had to seize this opportunity. He really wanted a role in that movie, and if that meant cooperating with Ellington, he was willing to endure that. Natalie went about her morning business at home. She saw more and more momentum for Tony on social media, which put her in an excellent mood. When Mrs. Perkins saw Natalie's expression, she was pleased. She'd been worried about Natalie last night. "Mrs. Clare, I can see that you're happy this morning. Is there something good happening?" Mrs. Perkins asked with a smile. Natalie smiled back. "Yes, Mrs. Perkins, there is indeed something good happening today." She wanted to share her good news with Mrs. Perkins, but just then Bryce came down the stairs. "Good morning," Natalie called brightly. He replied with a faint, distracted, "Hmm." He seemed cold, distant. Mrs. Perkins frowned and looked from Bryce to Natalie. She didn't like this dynamic between them. She thought that sometimes they didn't seem to be truly a husband and wife. But Natalie seemed unconcerned. She said excitedly to Bryce, "Hey, do you know how many fans Tony Bavel has gained overnight? I'm so excited." Bryce responded faintly with another, It was unclear what he was thinking about. Natalie continued, "And Bryce, it's all down to that tip you gave me about the crossing too. Tell me, how can I thank you for that?"
Feeling the phone. Join 10,000 plus. Stop the.
Episode 65, An Unwelcome Visitor. If Bryce hadn't told Natalie about the crossing too, she wouldn't have been able to seize the opportunity for Tony so quickly. Freshly returning to the country and with no connections, there's no way she would have had this chance without Bryce. But Bryce said, "Actually, you don't need to thank me. This is all your own achievement. I didn't do anything." He took a sip of the coffee and glanced at her. Secretly, he was impressed with Natalie. He could see that she was a very capable operator. He'd only given her the lead about the movie announcement casually. The snippet of information so effectively. Social media account for the crossing too, and read the comments of the excited fans there. It was clear that the crossing too was really stirring up emotions among the denizens of the internet, and it looked like Tony Bavel was the favorite to play the second male lead character, Zeb Ballard. Seeing this, Bryce said to Natalie sincerely, "This is great work, Natalie." She gave him a shy, grateful smile. Bryce looked away. Somehow, he would rather see her as the proud. After breakfast, Natalie went to the office. As soon as she arrived, she detected a strange atmosphere in the air. Everyone seemed to be looking at her differently. There was surprise, admiration, and envy in their eyes. There were even some poisonous glances directed at her. Natalie shrugged this all off and headed for the practice room. There were quite a few people in the training room. Although Star Entertainment was not considered to be a major player in the industry, it was still a substantial operation. There were quite a few celebrities among the people in the practice room. Seeing Natalie arrive, a few people immediately greeted her. Their attitude had changed very quickly. Natalie remembered how coldly they had still been treating her the day before. But she just smiled at everyone and acknowledged their greetings before going to seek out Tony. As she'd expected, she found him in the training room furthest from the entrance. Tony loved silence. When she found him, he was struggling with a very difficult martial arts move. His sports clothes were already soaked in sweat, but he clenched his teeth and persisted. He didn't see Natalie watching him from the door. After 10 minutes or so, Tony successfully completed his routine. Natalie was delighted, applauding him from the doorway. She went over and shook his hand. "Tony, that was really great. I'm so impressed," said Natalie sincerely. "That was really great. I'm so impressed," said Natalie sincerely. "That was really great. I'm so impressed," said Natalie sincerely. "That was really great. I'm so..."
Thank you. Yun na, wala na. Mahirap. Thank you.
His face looked young and bright. Natalie added, "You're doing great work here, but you must make sure you continue to work hard."
Good evening.
As long as you focus on yourself and your skills, you can be confident opportunities will come your way. She knew that they were approaching a critical moment in the cast selection for The Crossing 2. The words and actions of any candidates for roles in the movie would be magnified infinitely on social media. This wasn't the time to slack off or make mistakes. Tony knew that Natalie was doing all this to boost his chances of securing a part in The Crossing 2, but there was still doubt in his mind. After being in the shadow for so many years, could he really still do it? Tony felt a bit strange when he thought about how Natalie had told him so many times to have confidence in himself. She wasn't much older than him, he thought, but she was much more clear and decisive. How did she do it? Everything Natalie had done for him gave him a sense of security and confidence in himself. He said again, "I won't let you down. I promise." Natalie nodded, then went to her office. She needed to formulate a plan for when Tony became famous again. She was surprised to find that there was already someone in her office when she got there. After a moment, she recognized him. It was the guy she'd bumped into in front of the building the other day. He was sitting back in her office chair, casually turning a pen over in his hand. Natalie, annoyed and surprised, said aggressively, "What do you think you're doing?" Howard Clare's eyes lit up. "Natalie," he said, "it's good to see you two. Long time no see." She didn't understand what this guy was trying to do. She said, "Look, seriously, what are you doing in my office?" Howard chuckled. He seemed to be in a good mood and teasingly asked, "Why are you so hot-tempered?" "I came to your office because I missed you and wanted to see you. Didn't you miss me too?" He stood up and came to stand close to Natalie, looking intently at her face and touching her shoulder with his hand. Natalie, startled, took a step back. "Get away from me! You've got a nerve," she said, her voice filled with anger. Then she added coldly, "This is my office, and I don't want you near me. Get out." Howard hadn't expected to be treated like that. Affronted, he sneered, "Why not call security? I'd like to see who'd dare to kick me out." With that, he walked to the sofa and sat down, looking pleased with himself. It seemed like he wanted to waste some more of Natalie's time. Episode 66, Double Trouble. Natalie was taken aback by the man's arrogance. She didn't know who this person was, and she wanted to kick him out of her office. But before she could reach for her phone, the office door opened, and another man walked in. He took no notice of Natalie and walked straight over to Howard. "Ah, Mr. Clare," said the man. "So here you are. I have a document that
You're welcome,
requires your
Sissy.
authorization, please." Howard nodded and quickly signed
you,
the
Tings.
document. Natalie didn't know what to make of this. Mr. Clare? And obviously, he was in a position of authority of some kind. The assistant took back the document and left the office. Natalie thought hard and suddenly realized that this person must be Howard Clare, the corrupt boss of the company. When she thought about it a little more, it made her wonder what kind of a family the Clares really were. If Bryce knew about this, how could he tolerate the existence of such a badly run company in the family portfolio? Natalie looked at Howard with narrowed eyes. Howard thought that she would be a bit more polite to him now that she apparently knew his identity. He laughed complacently. "So I guess you know who I am now, huh?" He got up and started walking toward her. Natalie was infuriated. With a disgusted look in her eyes, she said, "Please stay away from me." Howard was surprised once more by Natalie's attitude towards him. He was accustomed to all the young and junior staff at the company deferring to him, and he was accustomed to being able to use his influence to pressure women into obliging him as much as possible. It was unusual for a woman like Natalie to challenge his authority, despite knowing his identity. Natalie said, "Work. Please leave." Howard's arrogance returned, and he said coldly, "As an employee, is this the attitude you normally adopt towards your boss? If you persist in acting like this, you'll soon be laid off." But to his surprise, Natalie wasn't intimidated at all. She answered, "What's wrong with my attitude? If employees want to focus on doing their work, shouldn't the boss be happy? Do you have the attitude that a successful boss should have? Howard was almost speechless. He pointed his finger at Natalie, angrily stuttering, You dare to. He was thoroughly infuriated, his face darkening in anger. He was appalled that Natalie did not show him the deference he demanded. As they stood there facing each other, the door opened again. This time it was Mark Ellington who entered the office. Natalie rolled her eyes. It seemed as if her office had suddenly become low-life central today. She was about to usher them both out, but Ellington said, Natalie, I heard you being disrespectful to Mr. Clare as I was passing by. Mr. Clare is respectful towards you, and as a longtime employee here, I have to say that I think that. Then he said to Howard, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Clare, but I think you're way off beam. This company is in the early stages of its recovery, and we have to be honest with each other and work hard, no matter what. I'm merely trying to be clear and professional with Mr. Clare, so that he can always know the truth about how things really are in the company. I think that's what Mr. Clare would want as an effective boss. Isn't it, Mr. Clare? She looked at Howard, her eyebrows raised questioningly. Although Natalie was extremely annoyed with Howard, he was her boss after all. It wouldn't be good for her to offend Howard too badly. So she was constructing this way of framing what had happened between them. Howard was always willing to accept flattery. Seeing Natalie's gentle expression and hearing her conciliatory tone, any anger he had been feeling evaporated. He waved his hand and said, Well, I guess that's right. We need honesty and authenticity in the company right now while we rebuild. Natalie smiled politely. Ellington's face clouded with annoyance. He thought, oh, she really does have some tricks. Just a few honeyed words were enough to dissolve the trouble she was in. Maybe I've underestimated her. To change the subject, Ellington said to Natalie, Talking of work, actually, I really need to ask you something. How did you know in advance that the second part of The Crossing was going to be filmed? I hadn't heard about it at all until the official announcement. Ellington had glanced at Howard as he spoke, but Howard remained expressionless. Ellington's face sank. Could it be that Howard had told Natalie about the sequel in secret? He was suddenly suspicious. Natalie laughed and said, You must be joking. How would I know anything about it? It's just lucky that everyone can see how hard Tony Bavel is working and what a good match he would be for the Zeb Ballard role. Mark Ellington could only let out a hollow laugh. So that's it, huh? I guess you just lucked in, Natalie? You're really lucky. While Howard was there, Ellington couldn't resist an attempt to get Tony back under his control. So he said, Mr. Clare, you may not know it, but Tony Bavel was under my wing previously. He's been with me for almost 3 years. I'd appreciate it if you could arrange for him to be returned to my mentorship. I really care about